good morning, everybody, or whatever time of day it is where you are. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James. I'm going to be chairing today. So there's three of us today, me in Cambridge, and our two speakers are both up at the crack of dawn on the east coast of the US. So we have Sean King in New York and Shihoko Goto in Washington. And I'll just briefly introduce those before I let them loose. So Sean is Senior Vice President at Park Strategies, an advisory firm, and he's also an affiliated scholar at what I understand is pronounced the University of Notre Dame, Liu Institute for Asian Affairs. And previously to that, he used to work for the Department of Commerce as Senior Advisor for Asia, and he's also worked for consultants, banks, and New York State. And then our second speaker, Shihoko Goto, is the Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Wilson Center's Asia Program, a specialist in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, and their interactions with the US. And in her previous existence, she was an international journalist for a while, and she has also worked for the World Bank. So this is the rough timeline. That was my introduction. About 20 minutes each from the two speakers, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So over to you, Sean.
Great. James, thanks very much. Thanks to everyone who's here. Thanks to Alice, Nana, Edmund, and everyone else at Daiwa who's helped make this possible. As tragic as the pandemic is, I'm not necessarily going to say, I'm sorry we're connected virtually, because if we weren't connected virtually, we may not be connected at all. But hopefully it leads to an in-person meeting at some point. I have a special connection to the foundation because in 1998, when I was doing a graduate semester abroad in London, I actually attended 2 events at the Daiwa Foundation House. It means a lot to me to be connected today, albeit virtually. I'm just going to run through the region with a focus on Northeast Asia and see how I think each candidate may affect the various issues and topics in each of those countries. I'm not going to try to relitigate the issues because we all know what they are, but it's hard to say what could happen because presidents from one term, were Trump to win, again, presidents from one term to the next do change, as do their staff and as do circumstances. After all, it was only a year ago next month that we saw a new pneumonia emanating from Wuhan, and who knew then that it would change all the way we live in so many governments around the world. Plus, there are so many other issues out of the US president's control which will affect how they act. I'm thinking primarily of elections in other countries. If we just look from the transition from Obama to Trump, elections in South Korea, Canada, and the Philippines drastically altered how the US would approach various issues in the region. Plus, we also have all of Congress and 1/3 of the Senate up for re-election. Democrats will keep the House, and there's also a good chance they'll be able to flip the Senate for Republican control. So how much leeway a President Biden or President Trump would have on the Hill with a possibly changed Senate is also something to keep in mind, but something we can't know until November 3rd. All those caveats, we can still extrapolate a few things based on what we know from the candidates, the way they've acted so far, and what they've said on the campaign trail. So starting with the issue that tends to get the most attention, at least in my world, North Korea. If Trump were to win re-election, he said he's going to do lots of deals with Kim Jong-un, and I would expect that. Most notably, he might do an end-of-war declaration to formally end the Korean War, although one can credibly argue the circumstances for ending that war do not exist, seeing that North Korea has the world's 4th largest army, 80% of which is forward deployed at the DMZ, and still has not renounced its claim to retake South Korea. This could lead to what I would consider a very dangerous US-North Korea peace treaty, which somebody can ask me about in the Q&A if you want. I also think Trump, were he reelected, as he's done in Germany and Afghanistan, would decrease US troops in South Korea, which would be bad for Japan. President Trump likes to boast that since he started his direct diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, there have been no nuclear and or ICBM tests. That is true, but he'd also have to admit that it was on his watch that North Korea tested its first ICBM and also detonated its first hydrogen bomb. If Biden were elected, first of all, no more love letters between the US president and Kim Jong-un. And for any kind of face-to-face meeting to take place, I think there would have to be some kind of denuclearization deliverable baked in between the staffs. It wouldn't just be a meeting for meeting's sake. He also would not turn a blind eye to North Korea's medium and short-range missile launches, which greatly imperiled Japan. Biden would take a much more alliance-based view toward relations with North Korea, although I suspect that South Korean President Moon is happy with the way things are going, because as a member of South Korea's nationalist left, he urges reconciliation between North and South and kind of tends to see the North Korean side of things. That is why I think both South Korean President and North Korean leader South Korean President Moon and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un would like to see Trump reelected. Kim, for obvious reasons, because Trump's the only U.S. leader who would meet with the North Korean leader without preconditions. And even though Trump's given Moon a lot of heartache on trade and defense burden sharing, again, as a nationalist left South Korean leader, his chief aim is North-South integration and some kind of rapprochement. So I think that trumps, pun intended, everything else that Trump does to make his life difficult. Biden would, I think, ease up on demanding greater trade terms and bigger burden sharing from South Korea. And also, he would, again, take Japan's concerns much into more consideration than Trump has done. South Korea has often complained of a phenomenon called Korea passing, where the US, Japan, and China talk about North Korea without involving South Korea. But I think in this case, we could say under Trump, it's been a case of Japan passing, where Trump has not taken Japan's medium and short-range missile concerns into consideration and gone straight to North Korea while consulting with the South. I think Biden would integrate Japan much more into his regional calculus than Trump has done to date. Also, Biden might rejoin TPP if it could be renegotiated to his liking on certain environmental or labor concerns. That said, Japan has taken control of TPP since the US left, and I don't know how different it is now that we would be able to rejoin even if we wanted to. But I think Biden, or at least people within his administration, would look at the idea. Everyone's talked about what a great relationship Abe and Trump had, but I just don't see it. When Abe came to New York for the UN General Assembly in 2016, he took time to meet Hillary Clinton, but not Donald Trump. And as soon as Trump surprisingly won, Abe rushed to New York, Golden Golf Club at hand, to pay his respects at Trump Tower. But the two big things he wanted, which was US concern over North Korea medium and short-range missiles and staying in TPP, he lost both of those from Trump. So I don't really see what he gained. I guess the only thing you could say is, at least unlike Canada and Germany, he escaped the worst of Trump's wrath, unlike those other allies had to suffer these last 4 years. Now, in mainland China, I think Xi Jinping sees a lot of good and a lot of bad in Trump and probably can't make up his mind. On the one hand, Trump praises Xi and talks about the great relationship they have. And at the end of February, Trump was still tweeting his support for Xi Jinping on how he was handling COVID-19, lest we forget. Also, Trump's sown a lot of discord among US allies in Asia, left the TPP, which was an economic and trade power play against mainland China, and also, as a result of his negotiations or interactions with Kim Jong-un, has suspended or canceled US-South Korea military exercises. Since 1950, Beijing has been trying to get the United States off the Korean Peninsula, and here Trump seems to be doing, at least in part, willing for him. So those are big pluses for Xi as it regards Trump. But at the same time, Trump has let loose anti-PRC forces within his administration and not held them back as previous presidents might have done. For instance, signing legislation on Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, and cracking down on mainland Chinese technology. People like Pompeo, Secretary of State, Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, previous staffers like Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, and also John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. Randy Schreiber was the defense staffer I met. They've all been let loose to sort of counter mainland China wherever they can. And most of that's been good, and Trump's let them run wild, as it were. Also, I got to say, Trump has been, since derecognition in 1979, the best U.S. president for Taiwan, somewhat surprisingly. In particular, this year, he sent his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Azar, Undersecretary of State Kroc to Taipei to meet with President Tsai. These are the highest level visits since derecognition in 1979. He's allowed $13 billion in arms sales, including 66 F-16 jets, which Taiwan's wanted for over 10 years. He's given President Tsai the red carpet treatment on visits to Denver, LA, Houston, even granted her a visit to the Johnson Space Center in Texas, which was the first time a Taiwan leader's been at a federal US property since 1979, when we recognized Beijing over Taipei. And he signed the Taipei Act, which, contrary to our own one China policy, encourages countries, especially in the Western and South Pacific, not to dump Taipei in favor of establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing. This would have the benefit of keeping the PLA Navy out of these berths in the Pacific Ocean, which is becoming a new battleground after the South China Sea is basically lost to mainland China. Solomon Islands dumped Taipei last year, and Mike Pompeo has aggressively lobbied Palau not to do the same. So that's very notable. Also, Trump signed the Taiwan Travel Act, which would encourage high-level visits between Taiwan and US government officials. The United States, along with Australia, France, and even countries like Sweden, lobbied for Taiwan to regain its observer status at this year's World Health Assembly. And also recently, US Ambassador to the United Nations, Kraft, had a conspicuously public outdoor lunch with Taiwan's representative to New York. And when Taiwan's new representative to DC, Bi Kim Hsiao, who friends of Taiwan, including myself, call Ambassador Hsiao, when she met with Stilwell, the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, it was actually on State Department grounds, where usually it would have been somewhere off-site and not publicized. In this case, the US State Department tweeted out the meeting. So there's definitely been a sea change as regards US-Taiwan relations. Whether or not when it would stay in a second Trump term, I don't know, but so far it's been pretty good. Hard to say what she wants because it's a mixed bag with Trump, and Biden might ease up on trade on tariffs. And those tariffs, I will remind, despite what President Trump says, US importers and consumers pay those tariffs, not mainland China. He might ease up on tariffs and the trade war, as it were, and dial back some support for Taiwan. But he would also do a lot, presumably, to reinvigorate alliances in East Asia, and that would be to Beijing's detriment. Either way, I think Trump's phase one trade deal with Beijing is done, no matter who wins, because given the animus right now between Washington and Beijing, I don't see how we pick up the pieces of that deal. Tsai in Taiwan, I'm sure she feels safer with Trump based on what she's gotten, but if Biden wins, she'll reach out to him and his staff and also remind herself that when the United States dumped Taipei for Beijing in '79, Biden voted for the Taiwan Relations Act as a senator in 1979 to create the unofficial relations we have with Taiwan today. Looking around other places in the region, Duterte, I think, hates any American leader, but he'd probably deal with Trump better than Biden just because Trump's not going to push him on human rights, war on journalism, or the drug war. Thailand, the military junta, I'm sure, so long as they stay in power, I'm sure they'd rather have Trump there too for the same reasons. Vietnam, no one's benefited more from Trump's trade war with Beijing than Vietnam has. Mexico too, because so much business has gone there. But Vietnam probably remembers that when Biden was vice president, it was Obama who lifted the lethal arms embargo on Vietnam to help counter mainland China in the South China Sea. Also, Trump has recently turned his attention to Vietnam's currency manipulation and trade deficit, and they could end up in his crosshairs like Beijing is now in a second term. So I think Vietnam would default prefer Biden too. And Singapore also, just because of belief in the natural world order that the United States actually helped largely created, and hopefully that United States would rejoin TPP. If Biden's elected, I would hope he'd keep the good parts of what Trump's done in terms of cracking down on mainland Chinese technology, other aspects of unsavory behavior from Beijing, and also standing by Taiwan, but overlaying with the reinvigoration of our alliances in East Asia and not fighting with everybody at the same time and try to pick our battles more carefully. If Trump wins, he probably wouldn't listen to me anyway, and who knows what he will do. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Shihoko. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here today. Sean is a very hard act to follow. He did cover a lot of ground there. I've been asked to really focus on US-Japan relations and what the future may hold for the two countries. But in order to do that, I really wanted to focus on what has changed in US-Japan relations over the past 4 years under the Trump administration. And there are three elements that I really wanted to highlight. The first one is the convergence of the perception of how Japan is seen in the United States between Washington and New York. And what do I mean by that? For New York, the financial capital of the United States, Japan has always been an important partner. There's been a lot of interest, there's been a lot of capital, there's been a lot of investments from New York into Tokyo. In Washington, though, since the downturn of the Japanese economy 20 odd years ago, the focus has very much shifted away from Japan into China, and that trend has only accelerated over the years. What we have seen under the Trump administration, though, is that there is renewed interest in Japan. I know that Sean did say that he doesn't really see how the friendship between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump has actually been to Abe's benefit. I actually agree with that assessment, but at the same time, there is growing expectation here in the United States as well as in other countries, especially across Asia, about Japan taking on a greater role as a regional stabilizer, as a lot of the risks in the region that Sean has highlighted, including North Korea and the militarization of China, has increased. And certainly at that time, Prime Minister Abe has risen to that challenge, and he's taken on a more hawkish approach to Japanese foreign policy and a great desire for Japan to really punch above its weight in the diplomatic as well as security spheres, and not just limited to economic issues. And on the part of the United States, there has been a growing, not just acceptance, but a growing desire for Japan to become more muscular militarily and to actually reform its constitution as well, so that Japan can actually play a greater role as a powerhouse in the region, if not the world. The second issue that I wanted to raise was Japan's leadership in trade and beyond as well. Of course, the United States, one of the first things that Trump did after taking office was to pull the United States out of the TPP, but it did not stop Japan from taking on a central role in ensuring that TPP and its new version, CPTPP, made it to the finish line. And what Japan has done since then, at a time when the Anglosphere, the United States, as well as the UK and other countries have looked less towards multilateral deals, Japan has actually reached out to the European Union, concluded the bilateral Japan-EU trade deal, and of course it recently concluded the UK-Japan trade deal as well. What is interesting, though, is that Japan has also started focusing much more, not just on being an active player in multilateralism through trade negotiations, but it has stepped up to the role of becoming a rule maker, as opposed to simply being a rule follower. And it has also taken on a greater role in trying to keep the United States engaged in Asia, to ensure that the United States does remain a Pacific power. One of the ways that that has continued under Trump has been to come up with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, had initially been started as an idea by none other than Prime Minister Abe during his first term, around 2007, when he gave that idea in front of the Indian Parliament. But that has really taken off and embraced by the Trump administration and further developed by the Trump administration. And Japan has really tried to follow and to encourage the United States to ensure that it is continuing to be that power that Japan wants it to be. Japan has come out of this as a champion of ensuring that there is commitment to the rule of law, and above all else, to ensure that there is status quo in the region as well. The third issue that I want to highlight is the rise of the middle powers. So here in Washington, we tend to see things in a very black and white way under the Trump administration, so that there is a strategic competition between Beijing and Washington in a very G2 bipolar world. But the reality, of course, is that neither the Chinese-led world order nor currently the US-led world order seem particularly attractive. And for Asia, including Japan, on the one hand, China is their biggest trading partner. And on the other hand, they remain very dependent on the US security umbrella. Under those circumstances, what these middle powers want is to not be forced to choose either between Beijing or Washington, despite growing pressures on both sides. Southeast Asia has done a fairly good job of this, by and large, by being able to play off this great power competition. Whereas Japan, it's played this pivotal role as a glue to keep the United States engaged on the one hand. And on the other hand, what's interesting is that this increased US-China competition and greater hostility in trade relations in particular has actually brought Tokyo and China together. And what is happening in this rise of the middle powers is that we're beginning to imagine a regional order with a decreased Washington presence. And that is particularly true on the trade front, but we are also seeing that on the security front as well. So what comes next? What will happen after the US elections? I think it's fair enough to say that we're not going to see a return to the pre-Trump days, even if Biden, even though he was vice president under the Obama administration, wins. And certainly there will not be a return to the pre-Trump days if there is a second Trump administration. And I guess thematically, there are three issues that I see as continuing to be central to US foreign policy vis-a-vis dealing with Asia and enhancing relations with Japan. The first is that the competition between the United States and China is here to stay. At the same time, there is still a lack of clear objective in what the United States wants, both from the Republicans as well as the Democrats. It's clear that they're frustrated, both sides are frustrated with the Chinese playbook on the economic sphere in particular. But if there is to be pushback against the Chinese-led established order, what do they actually see? That's actually not as clear as it could be. We do know that under a Biden administration, there would be more appetite for multilateral cooperation, and there would be pushback against so-called non-market actors, namely China. We are already seeing that in the WTO, where Japan and the European Union, as well as the United States, are working trilaterally to push back against China's unfair trade practices. But this will probably be stronger in other spheres as well. Whereas if it were to be a second Trump administration, this unilateral approach to trade negotiations will continue to accelerate. And that actually puts Japan in a very difficult place because on the one hand, it does want to continue to have good relations with the United States, but on the other hand, it will become increasingly difficult for Japan to remain on good terms with China as well, given the increased US pressure to align with China, to align with Washington against China. The second issue that will remain after the election, regardless of the results, will be increased technology competition and an increase in economic nationalism. I don't know if any of you actually saw the vice presidential debate last week between Senator Kamala Harris and Vice President Pence, but it was interesting where Senator Harris said that the United States has already lost against China, especially on the economic front. And already last month, the Democratic Party has unveiled a package that they are proposing to boost US domestic competitiveness to the tune of about $350 billion to invest in innovation, to invest in research with an eye to competing against China head on. And we know also that if Trump were to win again, he would probably continue to play up on popular sentiment against China, probably take on more policies that would close its borders to Chinese enterprise and to Chinese investments and capital flow both ways. But we also do know that both the Democrats and the Republicans will be about increasing domestic competitiveness, which means that because they would be so focused on enhancing America's own economic foundation, the bandwidth to actually go into trade negotiations and to actually call for greater multilateralism on and push through trade agreements may be especially challenging. The one exception that I see on this is on Taiwan. Sean talked to some extent to address some of the challenges, some of the opportunities that have come to Taiwan under the Trump administration, but certainly the push for Taiwan to pursue a bilateral trade agreement with the United States will continue. And I believe that both a Biden administration as well as the Trump administration would seriously consider that as a solid foreign policy move as well as a solid economic decision as well. And that would actually push Japan to end its own or readdress its own strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. The third and final point that I want to make is that there will be a rethinking of partnerships to reflect the new realities of the region, whether it is a Biden presidency or a continuation of the Trump administration. What do I mean by that? On the security front, Trump has really raised this issue of better burden sharing. The way he describes it may not reflect the reality, but the sentiment behind it, that there is deep frustration within the United States that Japan is not pulling its weight, neither are some of the European partners in terms of committing to security in the region, is inadequate. This conversation, this push will be inevitable and it will continue to dodge the Suga administration as well. There will be whether or not the Indo-Pacific strategy under Trump will continue is a big question. I personally don't think this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy will have much leg after in a Biden administration. However, that does not mean that there isn't an interest to ensure that there is greater presence in the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Far from it. It's actually that they will take on a new way of building up that alliance. I'm thinking in particular about the Quad between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, and those will be the key players, I believe, under a Trump administration in pursuing the kind of stability and the status quo that really would be to the greatest interest of Japan. On the trade front, we've already seen the push for RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which does not include the United States, but does include China. Japan had pushed for India to be part of RCEP as well. India is not expected to be part of it. The negotiations are expected to conclude by the end of this year. And that to say that not having India be part of RCEP as a major setback for Japan would be an understatement. But again, we're seeing a lot of flexibility on the part of the Japanese government, and we are seeing a trilateral emerge between Australia, Japan, and India. And this is in the form of the supply chain resilience initiative. Details are being fleshed out at the moment, but what we do know is that there is a greater need for close cooperation between Japan and India, as well as other partners, that not marginalize or belittle its partnership with the United States, but really act as a hedge against some of the uncertainties that the United States may face. I think I've come to my time, so I was actually going to talk a little bit about COVID, but perhaps if there is interest from the audience, we can talk about that. But for now, why don't I stop there?
So it just remains to me to thank you both very much for helping us out by speaking to us so early in the morning. And I see the sun has hopefully risen behind you, Shihoko.
Yes, yes, finally.
So hopefully you'll be able to get on our breakfast now. But thank you very much, and thank you for listening in as well.